Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at a map of India today, it feels incredibly stable, like the borders, the states, the union territories, they've always been exactly where they are.
Right.
But the source material you've shared paints a much more dynamic picture, showing how that map has fundamentally changed over time and how those changes are deeply rooted in some very specific powers given by the Indian Constitution itself.
That's the fascinating part, isn't it? The political geography of India isn't some ancient, unchanging artifact. It's a carefully constructed and continuously evolving entity, shaped by legal provisions and historical forces acting within a framework that is, well, quite unique among federations.
And that's our deep dive today. We're going through this stack of sources, articles, research notes, specifically zeroing in on the foundational articles of the Indian Constitution, particularly Articles 1 through 4. Our mission is to extract the absolute most important nuggets, understand the principles that define India's fundamental structure, its union and territory, and then trace the captivating historical journey of how its geographical and political units have been formed, altered, and even renamed since independence, all strictly guided by the information right here in this material.
It's a deep dive into the very building blocks of the nation's political map. We'll grasp the foundational ideas from those first few articles, see the significant authority Parliament holds in this process, and walk through the chronological evolution of the states and territories, seeing how theory met reality on the ground.
All right, let's jump right in at the beginning then. Where does the Constitution start when defining India? What's the first step?
It begins, as our source material highlights right there with Article 1.
Yeah.
This article sets the stage by doing two fundamental things. It declares the name of the country, and it describes its nature, or, the type of polity it is.
And the name is given as India, that is Bharat. I found it interesting that the source mentions there wasn't even complete agreement on the name in the Constituent Assembly debates. That's quite something.
That's right. It really reflects the different visions present at the time. Some members strongly favored the traditional indigenous name Bharat, emphasizing, continuity with India's ancient past.
Right.
Others preferred the modern, internationally recognized name India. The solution, as the Constitution stands today and as explained in the source, was to embrace both, using the formulation India, that is, Bharat, as the official name. It feels like a nod to both streams of thought, doesn't it?
It really does. A synthesis, kind of. Okay, so that's the name sorted. What are the nature of the polity? Article 1 describes it as a union of states. Why that specific term, union, when India's structure is often described as federal?
This is where the source material offers crucial insight, quoting Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's explanation to the Constituent Assembly. He specifically addressed why the term Union of States was preferred over, say, Federation of States. According to Ambedkar, there were two key reasons for this choice.
Okay, what was the first one?
The first reason, he argued, is that the Indian Federation is not the result of an agreement among the states. Unlike some other federations, like the United States perhaps, where sovereign states came together and entered into a pact to form a union.
Like a contract.
Exactly, like a contract. India's formation wasn't based on such an agreement between pre-existing independent units. The process was different. The states as we know them today were largely created by the union itself rather than the other way around.
Okay, so it wasn't a coming together of equals via contract. Interesting. What was the second reason then?
The second reason, which Ambedkar emphasized as perhaps even more significant, is that the states in India have no right to secede from the federation. The union is presented as, well, perpetual and indissoluble.
No right to leave the union. That feels like a foundational principle right there. Very clear.
It absolutely is. The source quotes Ambedkar stating that the federation is called a union precisely because it is indestructible. The country is conceptualized as an integral whole, and its division into different states is merely for the convenience of administration, rather than reflecting any inherent sovereignty or independent origin of those states.
So the states exist because the central government created them or maintains them for administrative purposes, not because they were independent entities that decided to join up.
That's the strong implication of Ambedkar's reasoning presented in the source, yes. And this point is critical when we later contrast India's structure with others. The source later describes the USA, for example, as an indestructible union of indestructible states. In that model, the state's territorial integrity is constitutionally guaranteed, and altering their borders generally requires their consent. India's Union of States model, as defined by Article 1 and explained by Ambedkar, sets up a very different relationship between the center and its constituent units right from the outset.
That fundamental difference is important to grasp early on, definitely. So Article 1 also defines the scope of India's territory. How does it classify it? What falls under India?
Right. Article 1 classifies the territory of India into three main categories. First, there are the territories of the states themselves. Second, you have the union territories. And third, any territories that the government of India may acquire at any time in the future.
And the source points out a distinction between Territory of India and Union of India. What's that about? Sounds a bit subtle.
It is subtle, but it's an important legal distinction. Territory of India is the broader term. It encompasses all of the geographical area India controls, so that includes the states, plus the union territories, plus any future territories that India might acquire down the line.
Okay, everything geographically.
Exactly. The Union of India, on the other hand, is a narrower term, referring specifically to the federal structure and the distribution of powers. It includes only the states, which are the members of the federal system that share power with the center.
Ah, I see. So the states are part of both the territory and the union, but UTs and acquired territories are part of the territory but not the union in that specific federal power-sharing sense.
Precisely. The source clarifies that while states participate in the federal power-sharing arrangement, union territories and any acquired territories are directly administered by the central government. They don't have the same autonomous status or shared powers as the states. That explains their different administrative structure, you see.
Makes sense. And that third category mentioned territories that may be acquired. Does the source explain how India, as a sovereign state, can actually go about acquiring foreign territories? What are the ways?
It does. As a sovereign nation, India has the inherent right under international law to acquire new territories. The source lists the recognized modes for this acquisition. These include cession, which can happen through various means like a treaty with another state, purchase, gift, lease, or even as a result of a plebiscite where the people vote to join India.
So essentially, another country formally transferring territory to India.
Precisely. Other modes listed are occupation, which means taking possession of territory that wasn't under the control of any recognized ruler before. Conquest, though this method is less relevant in modern international law, thankfully. And subjugation, which is usually related to the aftermath of conflict.
And the source gives us specific historical examples of territories India actually acquired after the Constitution came into effect.
Yes, it lists Dadra and Nagar Haveli, Goa, Daman and Diu, Puducherry, and Sikkim. These are concrete instances where India exercised its sovereign power to bring previously foreign-controlled, or in Sikkim's case, protectorate territories into the fold of the Indian Union. We'll certainly dive into the unique stories of how each of those was integrated a little later on. It's quite a history for each.
Looking forward to that. So Article 1 lays out the name, the nature as a union of states, and the different kinds of territory India comprises. Now, moving on, the source highlights Article 4, which makes a really significant procedural point about changing the map, doesn't it?
Yes, this is a crucial piece that directly ties into Parliament's power. Article 4 makes a specific declaration. Laws made under Article 2, which deals with the admission or establishment of new states, and laws made under Article 3, which deals with the formation or alteration of existing states, are not to be considered amendments of the Constitution under Article 368.
And what does that distinction mean in practical terms for Parliament? What's the impact?
It means that these changes to the nation's political map, creating a new state, altering borders, changing names, don't require the often complex and higher threshold process of amending the Constitution under Article 368.
Which usually needs a special majority, right?
Exactly. Typically a special majority in Parliament, sometimes even state ratification. Instead, Article 4 says such laws can be passed by a simple majority and the ordinary legislative process, like any other regular law.
Wow. So forming or changing a state isn't treated with the same constitutional rigidity as, say, changing fundamental rights or other core constitutional features.
Not at all. Article 4 specifically exempts these actions from the Article 368 process. This is a deliberate design choice by the Constitution makers, highlighted by the source, that grants significant flexibility and power to the central parliament to manage the territorial organization of the country.
That flexibility is key.
Think about it. If Parliament can redraw the boundaries and even create or abolish states with just a simple majority vote, what does that immediately tell you about where the real power in shaping the country's geography truly lies?
It tells me the power is firmly with the center, specifically with Parliament. It's not a power shared equally with the states, whose very existence and shape are subject to this simple majority rule. It's quite centralized.
Precisely. This mechanism, established by Article 4, is absolutely key to understanding how the map of India has been reshaped so many times since independence. It makes the process constitutionally straightforward, relatively speaking, for the central legislature.
That makes sense. Now that we know these changes don't need a complex amendment, let's look closer at what Parliament is actually empowered to do under Articles 2 and 3. What actions can they take?
Right. Let's start with Article 2. It's focused on bringing entities into the existing union. It empowers Parliament to admit into the Union of India or establish new states on such terms and conditions as it thinks fit.
So this is about states that are currently outside the Union, adding to the family, so to speak.
Yes, that's the key distinction the source draws. Article 2 relates to states that are not already part of the Union of India. The power granted is twofold, according to the source. Parliament can admit new states that are already in existence as political units before joining India.
Okay.
Or it can establish new states, perhaps by creating a new political entity out of a territory that wasn't previously a state, like maybe an acquired territory.
Okay, so Article 2 is about external additions. What about Article 3 then? That seems to be where a lot of the action happens internally.
Article 3 is indeed all about the internal restructuring of the territories of the states that are already constituent units of the Union of India. It provides Parliament with quite comprehensive powers for internal readjustment.
What specific actions does Parliament have the authority to take under Article 3 regarding existing states? Can you list them out?
Sure. The source lists 5 distinct actions Parliament can perform. First, it can form a new state. This can be achieved by separating territory from an existing state, or by uniting 2 or more states, or even parts of states, or even by uniting any territory to a part of any state.
So combining or splitting existing pieces, basically.
Exactly. A lot of flexibility there. Second, Parliament can increase the area of any state. Third, it can diminish the area of any state, meaning it can literally shrink a state's geographical size.
Shrink a state. Wow.
Fourth, it can alter the boundaries of any state. And fifth, it can alter the name of any state.
That's a vast amount of power over the existing state's fundamental identity and geography. Seems almost absolute internally. And the source mentions an addition made by the 18th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1966. What did that do?
Yes, that amendment clarified something important. It basically stated that Parliament's power under Article 3 is broad enough to also include forming a new state or even a union territory by uniting a part of any state or a part of any union territory to any other state or union territory. It just reinforced the flexibility to mix and match territories across state UT lines.
So Parliament has these immense powers, but Article 3 does mention some conditions or procedures, right? That not completely unchecked.
It does lay down 2 important procedural requirements, yes. First, any bill aiming to make these changes, forming a new state, altering area, boundaries, or name, can only be introduced in Parliament with the prior recommendation of the President of India.
Okay, so the president has to approve its introduction, like a gatekeeper function.
Yes, that's the first hurdle. And the second condition is that before the president makes that recommendation, they are required to refer the bill to the state legislature concerned to get their views on the proposal. This reference must be made within a specified period set by the president.
Okay, that sounds like the states get a chance to voice their opinion, which seems fair. But the source immediately makes a critical point about the weight, or lack thereof, of those views.
It does, and this is where the power dynamic becomes even clearer. The source emphasizes that the president, and consequently Parliament, is not bound by the views expressed by the state legislature. They have the complete discretion to either accept or reject those views, regardless of whether the state legislature sent them back on time or not.
So the state legislature's role is purely consultative. They can say what they think, maybe object strongly, but Parliament can just ignore it if they choose.
Precisely. Their views are sought, it's a procedural step, but they hold no binding power over Parliament's final decision. The source also points out that if Parliament decides to amend the bill after receiving the state's views, there's no constitutional requirement to send the amended bill back to the state legislature for fresh views.
That really streamlines the process for Parliament even further, doesn't it? Cuts down potential delays.
It does. And crucially, the source notes that for a union territory, the situation is even simpler. No reference whatsoever needs to be made to the concerned legislature of a union territory. Parliament can take any action it deems fit regarding a UT under Article 3 without even asking.
This really underscores the point you made earlier about the difference between states and UT states have some limited procedural voice, even if it's not binding. But UTs have essentially none in this process of changing their own structure or boundaries.
Exactly. And it brings us back forcefully to that description from the source, attributed often to Ambedkar's interpretation. India is an indestructible union of destructible states.
Right, that phrase again.
Parliament, the central authority, has the constitutional power to form new states, alter the size or boundaries of existing ones, or even, by combining or splitting, effectively destroy a state's current form, and it can do this without requiring the state's consent. The state governments, conversely, have no power to affect the existence or integrity of the union.
And again, that stands in stark contrast to the model in countries like the USA, where, as the source mentions, state territorial integrity is guaranteed, and the federal government needs state consent to alter borders, a fundamentally different setup.
The difference is absolutely fundamental to the nature of Indian federalism as derived from these articles of the Constitution. The power under Articles 2 and 3, combined with the procedural ease granted by Article 4's simple majority rule, gives the Union Parliament paramount authority over the political map of the nation.
Okay, this immense power raises an important question. One has actually gone before the Supreme Court, as the source details. Does the power to diminish the area of a state under Article 3 include the power to cede or give away Indian territory to a foreign country?
That specific question was directly addressed by the Supreme Court in a landmark case. The background, as the source lays out, was the proposed transfer of a territory called Burubari Union, located in West Bengal, to Pakistan. This was based on agreements made earlier, likely around partition or shortly after. This proposal caused significant controversy and led the president to seek the Supreme Court's advisory opinion on the matter back in 1960.
Okay, and what did the court rule? Can Parliament just give away territory using Article 3?
The court specifically held that the power of Parliament to diminish the area of a state under Article 3 does not extend to the cession of Indian territory to a foreign country.
So drawing internal boundaries is one thing, covered by Article 3, but giving territory away externally is a whole different category.
Exactly. The court's reasoning was that Article 3 only deals with the internal readjustment of India's existing territory. Ceding territory to a foreign state, which reduces the overall territory of India itself, was considered a more significant act impacting national sovereignty, and therefore required a higher constitutional threshold. The court ruled that such a cession would require an amendment to the Constitution under Article 368.
So it needs that special majority process, not just the simple majority under Article 3. And what happened with the Burubari territory then, following that ruling?
Following the Supreme Court's clear ruling, the Ninth Constitutional Amendment Act was enacted in 1960, specifically to enable the transfer of the Burubari territory to Pakistan, as per the agreement. This case really solidified the principle that altering India's external boundaries by ceding territory requires the Article 368 amendment process. Now, it's worth contrasting that ruling with a subsequent one mentioned in the source, from 1969. This later ruling dealt specifically with the settlement of boundary disputes.
Is settling a boundary dispute different from ceding territory in the eyes of the court? How does that work?
According to the Supreme Court in 1969, yes, there's a distinction. They ruled that a settlement of a boundary dispute with another country does not require a constitutional amendment under Article 368 if the settlement doesn't involve the actual cession or giving away of Indian territory to that foreign country.
So if it's just about clarifying an unclear boundary line, maybe based on interpreting an old treaty or award, that can be handled differently, without an amendment.
Correct. The court distinguished between a formal cession of territory, which unequivocally reduces India's overall area and requires an amendment, and the settlement of a bona fide dispute regarding where the existing boundary line actually lies. Such settlements, they argued, can often be accomplished by executive action through agreements without needing a constitutional amendment, as long as you're not actually giving up territory recognized as Indian. The key is whether territory is being ceded versus a boundary simply being demarcated or clarified according to existing claims or agreements.
That distinction makes legal sense, though I imagine it could get tricky in practice. And the source provides a very recent and significant example of territory exchange that did necessitate a constitutional amendment: the Bangladesh territory exchange.
Yes, this was a major exercise in regularizing the border, a really complex situation, and it required the 100th Constitutional Amendment Act of 2015. The purpose was to give effect to agreements between India and Bangladesh regarding the acquisition and transfer of certain territories, specifically these pockets of land called enclaves.
What were the specifics of that exchange as detailed in the source? It sounds quite involved.
It was incredibly involved. It involved the transfer of 111 Indian enclaves, essentially pieces of India, surrounded by Bangladesh to Bangladesh. And conversely, the transfer of 51 Bangladeshi enclaves located within India to India. It also covered the transfer of territories held in what's called adverse possession by either country land controlled by one but legally belonging to the other, and finally, the demarcation of a small 6.1-kilometer stretch of the border that had somehow remained undemarcated for decades.
And this massive exchange directly impacted the constitutional map, right? Because territories was changing hands.
Absolutely. It required modifying the first schedule of the Constitution, which, as you know, lists the states and their territories. Specifically, the territories of 4 states, Assam, West Bengal, Meghalaya, and Tripura, had to be adjusted in the schedule because their borders were directly affected by this exchange of enclaves and adverse possessions. Territory was gained and lost by these states.
The source also gives us a rich historical background for this exchange, showing it wasn't a sudden development but had roots going way back.
It traces it back to the very beginnings of partition, really. The India-East Pakistan land boundary was initially determined by the Radcliffe Award in 1947, but disputes arose over the interpretation of this award almost immediately. Attempts were made to resolve them, including through the Bag Award of 1950 and the Nehru-Noon Agreement of 1958.
And the Birubari issue, the one that went to the Supreme Court, actually rose from trying to implement that Nehru-Noon Agreement.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected these issues were. And even after the Supreme Court's ruling in 1960 and the passage of the Ninth Amendment for Birubari, the source points out a key detail. The transfer of the specific Birubari territories that were part of former East Pakistan couldn't actually be completed immediately. There were ongoing legal challenges and political complexities at the time that stalled it.
Wow, so even the amendment didn't immediately solve it on the ground, highlighting the long gestation of this issue.
It really does. Fast forward quite a bit, and on May 16, 1974, a comprehensive land boundary agreement was signed between India and newly independent Bangladesh, aiming to finally demarcate the border properly. However, the source notes that this 1974 agreement was not ratified by India at the time because, again, it involved the transfer of territory. And as the Supreme Court had ruled back in the Birubari case, such transfers required a constitutional amendment, which hadn't been done yet for the entirety of the border settlement outlined in 74.
So even the 1974 agreement hit that same constitutional roadblock identified back in 1960. Consistency, at least.
Exactly. It wasn't until September 6, 2011, that a protocol was signed between the two countries. This protocol identified and resolved the specific issues remaining from the 1974 agreement, the undemarcated boundary stretch, the adverse possessions, and, crucially, the exchange of those numerous enclaves. This protocol became an integral part of the 1974 Land Boundary Agreement, setting the stage for the final resolution.
And the source mentions this 2011 protocol was prepared with the support and concurrence of the concerned state governments in India.
It does, indicating a level of consultation, which is important politically, but ultimately, because this entire exercise involved the actual cession of Indian enclaves to Bangladesh and the acquisition of Bangladeshi enclaves by India, the process required the highest constitutional hurdle and amendment under Article 368.
Hence the 100th Amendment.
That's why the 100th Amendment Act in 2015 was necessary to finally give legal effect to this long-pending, incredibly complex boundary resolution. It's a perfect modern illustration of that Birubari principle at work. Actual transfer of territory needs the Article 368 amendment.
It truly is. It shows the legal framework in action over decades, dealing with really tangled historical legacies. So, we've explored the constitutional principles. Article 1 defining the Union, Article 4 setting the simple majority rule for internal territorial changes, and Articles 2 and 3 detailing Parliament's vast power over admission and internal reorganization, along with the crucial limits on outright cession. Now let's shift gears and look at the historical journey itself. How did these powers and principles actually shape the map of India, from independence to the complex mosaic of states and union territories we see today?
This is where the constitutional theory meets the messy, fascinating reality of nation building and popular aspirations. At the moment of independence in 1947, the map of India wasn't a clean slate of provinces, not at all. The source reminds us that India inherited two very different types of political units from the British era.
Right, the provinces and the princely states.
Exactly. You had the British provinces, which were under direct British rule, places like Bombay, Madras, Bengal. And then you had the hundreds of princely states, ruled by native princes, but subject to the paramountcy or ultimate authority of the British Crown.
And the Indian Independence Act of 1947 sort of threw those princely states up in the air,
Yeah.
defining their options.
It did. With the lapse of British paramountcy, the act essentially gave the princely states three theoretical choices. They could accede to either the newly formed Dominion of India or the Dominion of Pakistan, or theoretically, they could try to remain independent.
That sounds like it could have led to absolute chaos, incredible fragmentation,
Yeah.
a patchwork nation.
It was a monumental task of integration, a huge challenge, largely spearheaded by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who played a critical role. The source tells us that out of the 552 princely states located within India's geographical boundaries, an overwhelming 549 joined India relatively quickly and peacefully, persuaded by Patel and VP Menon.
That's remarkable. 549 out of 552. What about the three holdouts mentioned? Hyderabad, Junagadh, and Jammu and Kashmir. They have quite famous stories.
They do, and the source specifically details their integration process. Hyderabad, the largest and most powerful princely state, located right in the heart of India, was integrated through what was termed a police action in September 1948, essentially a military intervention to quell resistance and ensure accession.
Okay, and Junagadh.
Junagadh, a state in Gujarat whose Muslim ruler wanted to join Pakistan against the will of its majority Hindu population, was integrated differently. A referendum, a plebiscite, was held where the people overwhelmingly voted to join India.
And Jammu and Kashmir, always a complex case.
Very complex. Jammu and Kashmir, with its unique strategic location and demographics, acceded to India through the Instrument of Accession signed by its ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, in October 1947. This happened at a critical time when the state was facing invasion from tribal Lashkars supported by Pakistan.
So each case had its own method: military action, popular vote, ruler's accession under duress, reflecting the very challenges involved in consolidating the nation. Once these were integrated, how did India classify its administrative units in the 1950 Constitution? It wasn't the state UT system we have now, right?
No, not at all. The Constitution that came into effect on January 26, 1950, adopted a rather complex four-fold classification system for the states and territories, totaling 29 units across these categories. It was based on a mix of historical legacy and administrative structure.
4 categories, what were they?
Okay, so you had Part A states. These comprised the 9 former governors' provinces of British India entities like Madras, Bombay, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, etc. These had elected legislatures and governors carrying over the structure from the British era.
Right, the major former provinces. And Part B states.
Part B states consisted of 9 erstwhile princely states, or unions of princely states, that were large enough and significant enough to be given legislatures and were headed by a Raj Pramukh, often the former ruler. States like Hyderabad, Mysore, Rajasthan, and Travancore Cochin fell into this category.
Okay, former princely states with legislatures. What about Part C?
Part C states were a more diverse group, totaling 10 units. They included the former chief commissioners' provinces of British India, which were centrally administered areas like Delhi and Ajmer Merwara, plus some smaller princely states like Bhopal, Coorg, and Himachal Pradesh, which were also brought under central administration, headed by a chief commissioner or lieutenant governor.
So centrally run, smaller units mostly. And Part D, that sounds small.
Part D was the smallest category, comprising just one territory. The solitary Andaman and Nicobar Islands, located far out in the Bay of Bengal, which was also centrally administered.
That classification system, parts A, B, C, D, sounds quite complex and maybe a bit artificial compared to today's structure. The source mentions this ad hoc arrangement, based partly on history and partly on size and administrative capacity, soon led to significant demands for reorganization. People weren't happy.
They weren't, in many cases. The way units were grouped in 1950 didn't necessarily align with the deep-seated cultural or linguistic identities on the ground. This led to widespread and often intense demands almost immediately for states to be reorganized primarily on a linguistic basis. The core idea was that people speaking the same language should ideally be grouped into the same administrative state. This movement was particularly strong in South India.
And the central government initially resisted this idea of redrawing the map based on language.
Yes, there was significant hesitation at the top leadership level. The first official commission appointed to look into this, the Linguistic Provinces Commission, commonly known as the Dar Commission, was set up in June 1948. It examined the feasibility of linguistic reorganization, but ultimately, in its report in December 1948, recommended reorganization based primarily on administrative convenience, financial viability, and potential for development rather than language.
And that didn't go down well.
No, their report caused considerable disappointment and resentment among those strongly advocating for linguistic states. It felt like a dismissal of linguistic identity as a valid basis for statehood.
Which prompted the Congress Party itself to set up another committee to look into it.
Exactly. Faced with the strong public reaction, the Congress Party appointed its own committee in December 1948, famously known as the JVP Committee, consisting of three top leaders: Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Pattabhi Sitaramaiah. This high-level committee re-examined the issue, but their report, submitted in April 1949, also essentially formally rejected language as the primary basis for the reorganization of states. They worried it might fuel regionalism and undermine national unity, prioritizing unity and administrative efficiency instead.
So, two prominent bodies, one official and one party-based, rejected the linguistic principle as the main driver. Yet the demand didn't just disappear, did it? People kept pushing.
Far from it. The source highlights that despite these official rejections, the popular demand persisted and even intensified, particularly in the Telugu-speaking areas of the large multilingual Madras presidency. This culminated in a major agitation, led by a respected Gandhian leader, Parisharamulu.
Ah, the hunger strike.
Yes. His prolonged fast, a hunger strike lasting 56 days demanding a separate state for Telugu speakers, Andhra, garnered immense public support and put significant pressure on the Nehru government. His death in December 1952, after that 56-day hunger strike, is a powerful, tragic detail mentioned in the source. It became a major turning point.
His death must have forced the government's hand.
It absolutely did. The source states that his sacrifice and the widespread unrest that followed compelled the government of India to finally act. In October 1953, they were forced to concede the demand and create the first state specifically formed on a linguistic basis. Andhra State, carved out of the Telugu-speaking areas of the existing Madras state. The source even mentions specific details like Kurnool being designated the temporary capital and the High Court being established at Guntur.
The creation of Andhra must have been like opening the floodgates, right? It demonstrated that linguistic reorganization was possible, surely triggering similar demands elsewhere with renewed vigor.
It absolutely did. The source notes that the formation of Andhra intensified demands for similar linguistic states across the country in Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Punjab, and elsewhere. Recognizing that a piecemeal approach wouldn't work and a more comprehensive review was needed, the government of India appointed the States Reorganization Commission, SRC, in December 1953.
This was the famous Fazl Ali Commission,
Yep.
one that really shaped the modern map.
Yes, exactly. It was a three-member commission chaired by Justice Fazl Ali with two other distinguished members, K.M. Panikkar and Ashan Kunzru. They undertook a thorough review of the entire issue, traveling widely, hearing representations, and submitted their comprehensive report in September 1955.
And unlike the previous committees, they were more receptive to the idea of language as a basis for reorganization.
They were, yes. The Fazl Ali Commission broadly accepted language as a major factor, acknowledging its importance for culture and administration. However, and this is crucial, they were careful and pragmatic. They explicitly rejected the idea of a rigid one language, one state theory, which they felt could lead to excessive fragmentation and might harm national unity.
So balance was key.
Balance was absolutely key. Their primary emphasis, very much in line with the earlier committee's concerns, was that the unity and security of India should be the paramount consideration guiding any reorganization. Language was a factor, but not the only one, and certainly not one to override national integrity.
So language was important, but balanced against other factors in the overall national interest. What other specific factors did the commission consider? As listed in the source, what was their framework?
The source details the four major factors the Commission identified and explicitly considered in formulating their recommendations. First and foremost, the preservation and strengthening of the unity and security of the country. That was paramount. Second, linguistic and cultural homogeneity, acknowledging the importance of language and culture in shaping regional identity and administrative convenience. Third, financial, economic, and administrative considerations, basically, ensuring the proposed states would be viable and manageable. And fourth, the potential for planning and promotion of the welfare of the people in each state and, indeed, the nation as a whole.
A very comprehensive set of criteria. And what was the commission's final overarching recommendation based on applying these factors across the country?
Based on this balanced approach, the Commission recommended the complete abolition of the original four-fold classification system, the parts A, B, C, and D states. They found it irrational and complex. Instead, they proposed creating a simpler structure consisting of 16 states and 3 centrally administered territories.
16 states and 3 territories. How did the government implement these significant recommendations? Did they accept them wholesale?
The government of India accepted most of the recommendations, though with some minor modifications here and there. This acceptance led to the enactment of 2 major pieces of legislation in Parliament: the States Reorganization Act, 1956, and the 7th Constitutional Amendment Act, 1956. The amendment was needed to abolish the Part ABCD structure in the Constitution itself.
And what was the final outcome of these acts on November 1st, 1956? What did the map look like then?
These acts effectively redrew the map of India in one go. They abolished the distinction between Part A and Part B states, merging them into a single category of states. The Part C states were either merged with adjacent states or converted into a new category called Union Territories. The Part D territory, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, also became a Union Territory. As a result, on November 1st, 1956, India was reorganized into 14 states and 6 Union Territories.
14 states and 6 UTs. That's a huge simplification and reorganization compared to the 29 units under the 1950 map. The source lists the 14 states created then. Can you run through them?
Sure, the 14 states were Andhra Pradesh, which had already been formed linguistically but was now confirmed and potentially adjusted; Assam, Bihar, Bombay, a large bilingual state; Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Madras, Mysore, Orissa, Punjab, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal.
And the 6 union territories.
The 6 UTs created in 1956 were Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Delhi, Himachal Pradesh, Lakshadweep, Minicoy, and Amindivi Islands, later renamed Lakshadweep, Manipur, and Tripura.
And the source provides specific examples of how some of these new states were actually put together from the old Part A, B, and C units, showing the mechanics of the merger process.
It does, which helps visualize the change. For example, the new state of Kerala was formed by merging the erstwhile Part B state of Travancore Cochin with the Malabar district taken from the Part A state of Madras, plus the Kasaragod Taluk from South Kannada, also part of Madras.
So piecing together regions across old boundaries based on language, presumably Malayalam in this case.
Exactly. Andhra Pradesh, which was already the first linguistic state, was enlarged by merging it with the Telugu-speaking areas of the erstwhile Part B state of Hyderabad. The capital was also shifted from Kurnool to Hyderabad city. Madhya Pradesh, the central province, became very large by merging the existing Part B states of Madhya Pradesh and Vindhya Pradesh, along with the Part C state of Bhopal.
And Bombay State also grew.
Yes. The source mentions the large bilingual Bombay state absorbed the Part B states of Saurashtra and Kutch. Mysore state, later Karnataka, took in the Part C state of Coorg. Punjab incorporated the Patiala and East Punjab States Union, PEPSU, which was a Part B state. Rajasthan absorbed the Part C state of Ajmer, and the Lakshadweep, Minicoy, and Amindivi Islands were formed as a UT from territory detached from Madras state.
This 1956 reorganization was clearly a massive, pivotal undertaking, fundamentally transforming the country's internal structure based largely on the SRC's recommendations and Parliament's sweeping powers under Article 3 and 4.
It was absolutely foundational. It laid the groundwork for the map we largely recognize today. However, the source makes it very clear that even after this major overhaul in 1956, the process of changing the map didn't stop there. Not by a long shot. The political geography of India has continued to evolve significantly ever since.
So the map kept getting redrawn even after 56. The lines weren't final.
Constantly evolving. The source notes that changes continued, often driven by persistent popular agitations and evolving political conditions on the ground. The process frequently involved the bifurcation of existing states, often driven again by ongoing demands based on language or sometimes distinct cultural identity or regional neglect arguments. It shows that while 1956 was a major step, it wasn't the final word on organizing the country's diverse population.
Right, so let's take a look at that continuous evolution since 1956, tracing the key changes the source highlights. Where does the story pick up after the big reorganization?
We can start just 4 years later, in 1960. The large bilingual Bombay state, created in 1956 by merging several regions, including both Gujarati and Marathi-speaking areas, became the site of renewed, intense linguistic agitation. The Samyukta Maharashtra movement for a Marathi state and the Mahagujarat movement for a Gujarati state were very strong.
And that led to its division.
Yes. This pressure led to its division by the Bombay Reorganization Act 1960. The state was split into 2 new states, Maharashtra for Marathi speakers, with Bombay City as its capital, and Gujarat for Gujarati speakers, with Ahmedabad as its initial capital. Gujarat became the 15th state of the Indian Union.
Another major state created primarily on a linguistic basis then. What about the acquired territories we touched on earlier, the Dadra, Nagar Haveli, Goa, Puducherry? How were they formally integrated into the state UT structure after 1956?
Right, the source details that journey for each. Dadra and Nagar Haveli, which were under Portuguese rule until 1954 when they were liberated by local activists and then administered independently for a while, were formally integrated into the Indian Union in 1961. They were constituted as a union territory by the 10th Constitutional Amendment Act of that year.
And they stayed a UT until recently.
Yes, much later, as the source notes elsewhere. In 2020, this UT was merged with the adjoining UT of Daman and Diu by the Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu Merger of Union Territories Act 2019, forming a single larger union territory. But initially in 61, it became a UT.
Okay. And Goa, Daman, and Diu had a similar initial path, but a different end for Goa.
Yes, a bit similar start, different outcome for Goa. These territories were acquired from the Portuguese much later by the government of India through a military operation, Operation Vijay, in December 1961. They were then constituted together as a single union territory by the 12th Constitutional Amendment Act, 1962.
And Goa eventually became a state.
Exactly. The source notes that while Daman and Diu remained a union territory for a long time, until that 2020 merger with DNH, Goa was granted full statehood much earlier, in 1987. This was done by the Goa, Daman and Diu Reorganization Act, 1987, which separated Goa to become the 25th state of the Union, leaving Daman and Diu as a separate UT.
And Puducherry, the former French territory, when did that become a UT?
Puducherry, which comprised the former French establishments of Puducherry itself, plus Karaikal, Mahe, and Yanam scattered across South India, was handed over de facto by France to India back in 1954. It was administered as an acquired territory for several years until it was formally made a union territory by the 14th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1962, the same year Goa, Daman, and Diu became a UT.
Oh, so it seems acquired territories were generally integrated first as UTs using Parliament's power under Article 2, likely for administrative reasons, and then in some cases like Goa, later elevated to statehood using Article 3 powers. Interesting pattern. What was the next state creation after Gujarat in 1960?
The next state formed was in the Northeast. In 1963, the state of Nagaland was formally inaugurated. This state was created by taking the Naga Hills district and the Tuanzang area out of the large state of Assam.
And why was Nagaland created?
The source explains this was done specifically to address and satisfy the demands of the long-standing and often violent political movement of the Naga groups who sought greater autonomy and recognition of their distinct identity. As a step towards statehood, the region had actually been placed under the control of the governor of Assam in 1961, before becoming the 16th state in 1963 via the State of Nagaland Act 1962.
Then came significant changes in the Northwest in the mid-60s, involving Punjab.
Yes, a major reorganization occurred in 1966. The large state of Punjab, which remained bilingual, Punjabi and Hindi-speaking, even after the 1956 reorganization, was restructured following renewed demands, particularly the potent movement for a Punjabi-speaking state, strongly linked with Sikh identity politics.
And this led to a trifurcation.
Essentially, yes. The Punjab Reorganization Act 1966 led to the bifurcation, or maybe trifurcation is better, of the state. Haryana was created as the 17th state, carved out primarily from the Hindi-speaking areas of Punjab. The predominantly Punjabi-speaking areas remain as the reorganized state of Punjab. And the shared capital city, Chandigarh, was made a new union territory and designated as the common capital for both Punjab and Haryana.
What about the hilly regions of Punjab?
The hill areas of the original Punjab state, which were largely Hindi or Pahari-speaking, were merged with the adjoining union territory of Himachal Pradesh, significantly enlarging it.
And Himachal Pradesh itself was later elevated from a UT to a state.
Correct. In 1971, the Union Territory of Himachal Pradesh, now enlarged with those areas from Punjab, was elevated to the status of a full state, becoming the 18th state of the Indian Union. This was achieved through the State of Himachal Pradesh Act 1970. The source also mentions that the Shah Commission, set up in 1966 to determine the boundaries for the Punjab reorganization, had recommended the transfer of these hill areas to Himachal Pradesh and its eventual statehood.
So a clear link there. There was also a major reorganization in the Northeast around the same time, in 1972. That seemed to change the map there quite dramatically.
It was a huge reshuffle in the region, yes. It was carried out by the Northeastern Areas Reorganization Act 1971, which came into effect on January 21, 1972. This single act transformed several union territories in the region into full states and also created new union territories out of Assam.
Which UTs became states in 72.
The two existing union territories of Manipur and Tripura, which were princely states integrated earlier and made UTs in 1956, were elevated to full statehood. They became the 19th and 20th states of the Union. Additionally, Meghalaya was granted full statehood as the 21st state.
And Meghalaya had that interesting sub-state status before.
Yes, the source includes that detail. Meghalaya, predominantly inhabited by the Khasi, Jaintia, and Garo tribes, had previously been created in 1969 as an autonomous state, or sub-state, within the state of Assam by the 22nd Constitutional Amendment. This gave it some autonomy, its own legislature for certain subjects, but it wasn't full statehood. However, this arrangement hadn't fully satisfied the political aspirations of the people there, leading to the demand for complete separation and full statehood, which they got in 1972.
So it went from being a kind of state within a state to a full state itself.
Yeah.
What about new UTs created in 72?
The same 1971 Act created two new union territories by carving out more territory from the now much reduced state of Assam. These were Mizoram, which was previously the Mizo Hills district of Assam and had seen its own insurgent movement, and Arunachal Pradesh, which was known before as the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NEFA, a strategically important border area administered directly by the center but technically part of Assam.
Wow, so Assam was significantly reduced in size through these reorganizations. The Northeast saw multiple changes in a very short period then. What about Sikkim? Its integration story, as the source lays out, seems quite distinct from the others.
It is very unique because of its status before integration. Until 1947, Sikkim was an Indian princely state under British paramountcy, like many others. But after 1947, with the lapse of paramountcy, it didn't immediately accede to India. Instead, it became a protectorate of India through a treaty in 1950.
Protectorate. What did that mean practically?
It meant India was responsible for Sikkim's defense, external affairs, and communications. But Sikkim retained internal autonomy under its hereditary ruler, the Chogal. It was unique status, not fully independent, but not part of India either.
And how did it transition from protectorate to becoming part of India?
Well, over time, internal political movements grew within Sikkim, seeking democratic reforms and closer ties with India, often clashing with the Chogal. In 1974, the Sikkim Assembly, dominated by pro-integration parties, passed resolutions expressing a desire for closer association with India and for representation in the Indian Parliament.
And India responded.
Yes. In response, the Indian Parliament enacted the 35th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1974. This amendment was quite innovative. It created a completely new temporary status of associate state specifically for Sikkim. It added a new Article 2A to the Constitution and a new 10th schedule, outlining the terms and conditions of this special association, including representation for Sikkim in the Indian Parliament, a status never used before or since.
But the source notes this associate state phase was very short-lived. Didn't last long.
It was extremely short-lived, less than a year. The arrangement didn't entirely resolve the political tensions within Sikkim between the Chogal and the elected assembly. In 1975, events escalated rapidly, culminating in the Indian Army disarming the palace guards, the assembly declaring the Chogal deposed, and then holding a referendum. The source states the referendum results showed the people of Sikkim voted overwhelmingly in favor of complete integration with India and the abolition of the monarchy of the Chogal.
And that referendum led directly to full statehood within India.
Yes. Following that decisive referendum result, the Indian Parliament acted swiftly and passed the 36th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1975. This landmark amendment made Sikkim a full-fledged state of the Indian Union, becoming the 22nd state. The amendment was comprehensive. It amended the first schedule to list Sikkim as a state, and the fourth schedule, allocating seats in the Rajya Sabha to Sikkim. It also inserted a new Article 371F, containing special provisions to protect Sikkim's existing laws and distinct identity, reflecting its unique history. And importantly, it repealed the temporary Article 2A and the 10th schedule that had been introduced just the year before by the 35th Amendment.
That's a remarkable example of the Constitution being specifically adapted twice in 2 years through amendments to accommodate a very unique integration process. What happened in the map evolution after Sikkim joined in 1975?
The map continued to evolve, particularly with the elevation of more UTs to statehood. In 1987, 3 more Union territories were granted full statehood, becoming the 23rd, 24th, and 25th states of the Union. These were Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, and Goa.
Mizoram and Arunachal Pradesh were the UTs created from Assam back in 1972.
Precisely. Mizoram was granted statehood after the signing of the historic Mizoram Peace Accord in 1986 between the Government of India and the Mizo National Front, which brought an end to a 2-decade-long insurgency. This demonstrates again how political settlements can drive state reorganization. The State of Mizoram Act, 1986, formalized this transition.
In Arunachal Pradesh.
Arunachal Pradesh, which had been a UT since 1972 and NEFA before that, was also elevated to statehood, largely due to its strategic importance and development needs. This happened through the State of Arunachal Pradesh Act, 1986.
And Goa, we already touched upon its statehood in 87.
Yes, Goa, as we noted earlier, was separated from the UT of Goa, Daman and Dir, to become a full state through the Goa Daman and Dir Reorganization Act, 1987.
Okay, so 3 more states in 87. And then the map saw another cluster of significant changes right at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000.
Yes, the year 2000 saw the creation of 3 brand new states, largely carved out of existing large states. These creations were driven mainly by long-standing demands from specific regions within those states, arguing for separate statehood based on distinct cultural identity, regional backwardness, and aspirations for better governance and development. These new states were Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand, and Jharkhand, becoming the 26th, 27th, and 28th states respectively.
Which states were they carved out of? Where did they come from?
Chhattisgarh was carved out of the eastern, largely tribal parts of the state of Madhya Pradesh. Uttarakhand, which was initially named Uttaranchal when created, was formed from the northern hilly region of the state of Uttar Pradesh. And Jharkhand was created from the southern, predominantly tribal and mineral-rich region of the state of Bihar. The source notes the respective reorganization acts of 2000 for each of these creations passed by Parliament using its Article 3 powers.
And the most recent state formation before the major changes in Jammu and Kashmir in 2019 was Telangana, right?
That's right. Telangana came into existence as the 29th state of the Indian Union in June 2014. It was carved out of the state of Andhra Pradesh after another prolonged and often contentious popular movement demanding separation. The Andhra Pradesh Reorganization Act, 2014, was the legislation that created it.
And it's quite notable, as the source implicitly shows by recounting Andhra's earlier history, that the state Telangana was carved from Andhra Pradesh itself has such a dynamic past. It was the first linguistic state formed in 1953, then enlarged significantly in 1956, and now bifurcated in 2014. The cycle of reorganization just kept going.
It really underscores the dynamic nature of these boundaries. A state formed on linguistic grounds itself later faced demands for bifurcation based on regional identity and economic factors.
Finally, we come to the very significant and perhaps constitutionally unique changes regarding Jammu and Kashmir in 2019.
This was indeed a major constitutional and territorial shift, unlike any previous state reorganization. The source explains that until August 2019, the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir held a special autonomous status within the Indian Union guaranteed under Article 370 of the Constitution of India. It even had its own separate state constitution, which was unique.
And what happened in 2019?
In August 2019, this special status was effectively revoked or significantly altered through a presidential order called the Constitution Application to Jammu and Kashmir Order, 2019. This order superseded the earlier 1954 presidential order that had laid out the specific terms of Article 370's application and the extent of Parliament's power over the state.
And this action meant the entire Constitution of India now fully applied to J&K like any other state.
Essentially, yes. Almost all provisions of the Constitution of India were extended to Jammu and Kashmir. But the changes didn't stop there. Parliament then enacted the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act, 2019. This act did something unprecedented in the history of states' reorganization in India. It bifurcated the state of Jammu and Kashmir into 2 distinct union territories.
Wait, a state was converted into union territories, not split into new states or UTs upgraded to states, but the reverse. That truly puts the destructible states concept into sharp relief, doesn't it?
It's arguably the most powerful demonstration yet of Parliament's power, under the framework we've been discussing, the power to alter, diminish, and effectively reorganize a state's existence, even changing its status downwards. The act created the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, comprising all the districts of the former state except for Kargil and Leh. Those 2 districts, Kargil and Leh, were constituted into a separate Union Territory of Ladakh.
So instead of splitting a state into new states or merging parts or creating UTs from parts of states while the state remained, here an entire state was dissolved and its territory reconstituted as UTs. a very significant move.
It was constitutionally and politically a very significant change in 2019. And as a result of these changes in Jammu and Kashmir, combined with that merger of Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu, which became effective in January 2020, the source concludes by stating the current position of the Union and its territory. 28 states, down from 29 after J&K state ceased to exist, and 8 Union territories, up from 7 before J&K, then back down to 8 after the DNH and DD merger.
That's a remarkable transformation from the 14 states and 6 UTs we started with at the big 1956 reorganization. The map has been incredibly fluid.
Truly.
And it's not just the formations and reorganizations creating or splitting states and UTs. The source also notes, importantly, that the names of some states and UTs have also changed over time, utilizing another specific power granted to Parliament under Article 3.
Yes, altering the name is one of the 5 actions explicitly listed in Article 3 that Parliament can undertake through ordinary legislation. The source provides several examples of these name changes over the decades, reflecting evolving identities or preferences.
What are some key examples?
Well, the United Provinces, a major state in North India, was actually the first to be renamed, becoming Uttar Pradesh way back in 1950, right around when the Constitution came into effect. Much later, in 1969, Madras State, home to the Tamil language movement, was renamed Tamil Nadu.
Right.
Mysore State, representing the Kannada-speaking region, became Karnataka in 1973. In the same year, the Union territory of Lakshadweep, Minicoy, and Amindivi Islands got the much shorter indigenous name of Lakshadweep.
And Delhi's name changed too, although its status didn't become full statehood.
That's correct. The Union Territory of Delhi was redesignated as the National Capital Territory of Delhi in 1992. This was done by the 69th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1991, which also provided for a legislative assembly and council of ministers for Delhi, giving it a special status short of full statehood. The source is careful to point out that this redesignation did not grant full statehood, despite long-standing demands for it.
Any other recent name changes on the list from the source?
Yes, a few more in the 21st century. Uttaranchal, one of the states created in 2000 from Uttar Pradesh, was renamed Uttarakhand in 2006, reflecting local preference. Pondicherry, the Union territory comprising the former French enclaves, was renamed Puducherry in the same year, 2006, using the traditional Tamil name. And the most recent name change mentioned in the source is Orissa State on the East Coast, being renamed Odisha in 2011, again reflecting the local linguistic preference.
So name changes are also part of this ongoing evolution. The source even refers to a Table 6.4, which presumably lists many of the specific acts of Parliament, the Reorganization Acts, the Amendment Acts, the Statehood Acts that legislated these formations, reorganizations, integrations, and name changes throughout this entire history.
Yes, that table would likely be a great concise reference, laying out the specific legislative backbone for each of these territorial changes we've discussed. It shows how Parliament used its constitutional tools repeatedly.
Okay, we've really covered a lot of ground here, drawing heavily on this source material. We started with the foundational constitutional definitions in Article 1 India as a union of states. We looked at Article 4, making changes easier. We dove into Parliament's specific powers under Articles 2 and 3 to admit, establish, form, alter, and rename states. We examined the important limits on ceding territory established by the Supreme Court in the Birubari case and contrasted that with boundary settlements and the complex Bangladesh exchange. And then we took that long, detailed historical journey from the complexities of partition and integrating princely states through the 1950 classification, the powerful linguistic reorganization movement leading to under the Fazali Commission, the massive 1956 reorganization creating 14 states and 6 UTs,
Right.
and then the continuous evolution post-56, the bifurcation of Bombay, integrating former foreign pockets, creating Nagaland, Haryana, Himachal, the major Northeast reorganization in 72, the unique Sikkim story, more statehoods in 87, the 3 new states in 2000, Telangana in 2014, right up to the unprecedented changes in Jammu and Kashmir in 2019 and the recent UT merger, plus all the name changes along the way.
It's a comprehensive picture derived directly from the source material, showing how the constitutional framework, particularly Articles 1 to 4, has enabled and perhaps even encouraged this continuous process of reshaping India's internal political map. The source's summary table you mentioned, reinforcing the purpose of Articles 1, 2, 3, and 4, including the repealed 2A for Sikkim and the clarification in 4, concisely brings together the legal backbone of everything we've discussed. It really ties it up nicely.
So bringing all this together then, reflecting on this whole deep dive based on the sources, What does this dynamic history and this specific legal framework really tell us about the fundamental nature of the Indian Union? What are the big takeaways?
Well, one thing that's particularly striking is the inherent flexibility, or perhaps adaptability, built right into the Constitution regarding the territorial organization of the country. It clearly wasn't designed with static internal borders in mind. Instead, it seems designed with a capacity to adapt, evolve, and respond to changing administrative needs, political pressures, linguistic aspirations, and popular demands over time.
And it clearly places Parliament, the central legislature, right at the heart of that entire process. The power is very centralized in this respect.
Absolutely. The framework grants significant, almost supreme centralized power to Parliament to redraw the internal map. And that crucial point, clarified by Article 4, that these fundamental changes to states can be enacted through ordinary legislation with just a simple majority, really underscores this. This concentrated power is a defining feature of how India manages its territory, very different from many other federations.
It also vividly shows how constitutional law interacts with real-world social and political forces, doesn't it? The legal provisions in Articles 3 and 4 allowed for things like the linguistic reorganization, but the actual implementation, the drawing of those lines, was often driven by intense popular movements, political negotiations, sometimes even tragedy, like with Parishramalu.
Exactly. It's not just abstract law. The journey from that ad hoc classification at independence, through the intense pressure for linguistic states, the comprehensive attempt at rationalization in 1956, and then the subsequent continuous changes creating states for regional identity, for administrative convenience, after peace accords, or even, as we saw recently, converting a state into union territories, is a testament to this constant interplay between the constitutional framework and the political, social, and administrative realities on the ground.
Yeah.
The map changing from 14 states and 6 UTs in 1956 to the current 28 states and 8 UTs is the tangible outcome of this dynamic constitutional structure being put into practice over 7 decades.
It highlights a continuous balancing act, it seems, trying to accommodate India's immense regional diversity and various demands for autonomy or recognition, while simultaneously maintaining a strong, unified central authority that holds the ultimate power to define the units.
That tension, or perhaps that balance, seems inherent in the system described in these sources. It certainly does.
And that feels like a really thorough exploration of the source material you provided on this fascinating topic. We've taken a proper deep dive into the constitutional framework governing India's union and its territory. We traced the foundational principles in Articles 1 to 4, explored Parliament's significant power to shape the map, and followed that detailed historical evolution of how states and union territories have been formed, reorganized, integrated, and renamed, all strictly based on the information laid out here. Thank you for sharing this material and allowing us to unpack it together.
It was a fascinating body of work to go through, really illuminating. Thank you for guiding the discussion.
It really opened my eyes to how the map isn't just geography, but a product of ongoing constitutional and political processes. And thinking back on that core concept that kept coming up from the source India as an indestructible union of destructible states, it leaves you with a powerful, maybe slightly provocative thought to mull over. Consider how this unique feature of India's constitutional design, which allows the central government such profound power over the very existence and boundaries of its constituent states, power unmatched in many federations, has simultaneously served as the very mechanism used to accommodate immense regional diversity, often through the creation of linguistically or culturally based states carved out using that same power, while at the same time it undeniably ensures the ultimate supremacy and indivisibility of the Union. What does this particular, perhaps paradoxical balance between central power and regional accommodation mean for the practical reality and the lived experience of federalism in India today? Something worth pondering long after this deep dive is over.